Hello, guys. Welcome to the 12th episode of the Filip The Terran Podcast, where I interview Carlo Fedeli. He's an Italian living in London and trying to revolutionize how we store stuff and go away from plastic to using seaweed. So, this whole podcast episode is literally about seaweed and its applications for holding stuff, for food, for it's insane how many applications seaweed has, and you're going to learn that in this episode. So it's basically an episode talking about the future, and the future which is a future of seaweed. It sounds bizarre, but very interesting, and I think you're going to learn a lot from this episode. It's definitely one of the most entertaining ones. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll see you in the next one.
Hey,
Hello, Carlo. How are you?
fine, and you? How you doing?
I'm doing great. How's your week? How's your day? How have things been?
Good, good, good. Just feeling quite tired today, to be honest. It's just coming towards the end of the week, I guess. But yeah, it's good.
Productive? Productive week?
Enough. Yeah. You?
Okay. Also, I suppose most weeks I think recently I've been productive. I think I'm on good work form. I'm in good form. So yeah, definitely. So welcome to the pod. First of all, official introduction. How about we start off and you introduce yourself, to me, and although you did it before, but also to the audience. Tell us about what you do, what your background is, and why you came to speak with me today.
Sure, sure. So my name is Carlo. I'm an Italian living in London, CEO and co-founder of Flexi. Flexi being my startup, so the London-based startup developing biomaterials from seaweed. My
Mhm.
background is not the typical chemistry background or biomaterial background you might expect. I've done business studies, so I did my bachelor's in management and at Warwick, and my master's in innovation, entrepreneurship, and management at Imperial. And I decided to start a company whilst finishing my master over there.
Nice, nice. And what made you start it? What was the what and why? What was the trigger to start it during your studies?
So I've always been very interested in everything sustainability, which is the
Hmm.
heart of what we're doing, because we're developing a biomaterial from seaweed, which can truly decompose in nature, is home compostable, is even potentially carbon negative once it's produced because of the CO2 intake of seaweed. So it's all things that pertain to my interests. At
Hmm.
the same time, it just happened that around February 2020, I got interested into bioplastics in general. It's something that I was
Hmm.
reading into, getting interested in. And then when COVID hit, I was back home. I left. I went back home to lockdown really, and I was finishing my master's. Everything was shut here, so I might as well go home. And I realized the amount of plastic coming home, and I had a lot of time on my hands. So I decided to explore a project to try and make things better. And throughout lockdown, I transformed my house into a lab. And by the end of lockdown, I had a very first early prototype of what we're doing now.
Hmm.
Let's say that it's different than what it was back then, what the product we have today, but the
Hmm.
the basics, the skeleton, if you like, is there. So that's how
Hmm.
it started, really.
So when you were doing your market research and you were looking for plastic alternatives, why did you specifically pick seaweed? And what were the alternatives? So can you tell us about, like, because obviously this is so many people are trying to solve the plastic problem. I think everybody's aware of how much plastic we produce. It's crazy, and how big
Huge.
of a problem we have with it. So I'm sure you know a lot about the various potential solutions out there. So can you tell us about what they are, what are the benefits, what are the drawbacks, and why you went with seaweed in the end?
Yes. So I was looking at existing solutions to plastic. So what's out there? So one of the solutions for packaging is you want to replace plastic with paper, but that's a big hurdle because you have to actually replace all packaging machinery within the packaging chain and supply chain. So
Hmm.
that's a big sort of expenditure that companies will have to bear. Then you have plastic, other kind of plastic alternatives like bioplastics. The issue about plastics on the market today is that they're all derived from some form of a food crop or a starch-based material, whether it's a vegetable, food waste, whatever. But they're all derived from food crop, which means that they
Hmm.
are in direct competition with food production. And they
Hmm.
also, as these crops grow, so the bigger ones are, for example, sugarcane, sugar beet, potato, cassava in certain parts of the world, rice.
Hmm.
Think of a starchy vegetable, you can make bioplastic out of it. And these all require fresh water and arable land, which are two increasingly scarce resources. And throughout their life, they also need to be assisted with pesticides and fertilizers, which, I mean, aren't the nicest chemicals out there in most cases. And the end result is not even truly compostable. It is what we call industrially compostable. So it will not actually disappear in nature, will not degrade in nature. It will stay there, maybe not as long as petroleum-based plastic, but will stay there for a very long time. It needs to be brought to specific industrial composting facilities, which are very scarce and for which the post-consumption collection service and infrastructure is actually lacking. In fact, most of this plastic, the PLA, basically, mostly polylactic acid is the most common bioplastic out there. It's so similar to plastic, it actually ends up in the recycling bins. And so if and when it is brought to recycling facilities, because it's not plastic, it actually has contaminated the plastic batch. And so that means that whole batch will have to be incinerated. So it's actually counterproductive in that sense as well. And talking about recycling, that's sort of the third alternative out there. It is just not a viable solution, at least today. Again, when you look at, for example, PLA collection, I mentioned the infrastructure is lacking for post-consumption. With recycling, the infrastructure exists, but because it's relying so hard on what consumers do once they use up their resource, whether it's a plastic film, a plastic box, or whatever, it's really hard to get consumers to do the right thing. And for this reason, global recycling rates are averaging between 7 and 9%, which means you have more than 90% chance of your plastic, assuming you've put it in the recycling bin, it will not be collected for recycling, or it will be collected and then incinerated because it's too dirty or too thin or just not right enough for the recycling facility. So recycling also is not a solution. So I thought to myself, we need plastic because plastic is vital in many applications. I'm not here to demonize plastic. I mean, plastic is a great material. It lasts pretty much forever. It's super resistant to weather, temperatures, chemicals, whatever. It's indestructible. And this biggest strength is also its biggest flaw, in a sense.
Yes.
It's so good, you can't get rid of it. Well, we're using it for applications where we're literally getting rid of it after we only use it once. And that once often is within a few weeks of the product being made. So it just doesn't make sense. So I thought maybe for certain applications, we can use a biomaterial which is not derived from those food crops, which require all those scarce resources and are also in competition with food production. And that has an end of life, which even if it goes in nature, it will actually decompose. And so I looked into seaweed. There were companies doing some sort of bioplastic from seaweed, all in sort of research or very, very low scale. But they were using kelp and brown seaweed, which is it's a kind of seaweed which is less available out there from farm sources. When you look at globally the seaweed industry, you have roughly 50% of the seaweed industry being red seaweed, so the Rhodophyta family, and the remaining 50% being split with roughly 35% brown and 15% green, where brown seaweed is actually mostly taken from nature. Either it is because of washed up seaweed on shores, like we see the sargassum blooms in the Caribbean, for example, or from kelp forests. Kelp cultivation exists, but it's limited scale. Red seaweed, most of it, like over 90% of it, is actually cultivated, and it's more available. Also tends to be slightly cheaper. So let's try and do it with red seaweed. The polymers are different. We can make them interact with different chemicals, see how that goes, and it was basically trial and error. Like I went through about 100 different iterations of it in 4 months. I had a lot of times on my hands. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, that's one of the beauty of lockdown, I guess. One of the only beauties of lockdown.
So you said so many things there. There's so much to unpack, and there's so many questions. The first thing I wanna ask is, when you were looking at the market, you basically gave your view there on biopolymers, right? So you say that okay, it competes with food crops. I think this is pretty pretty easy to see why, right? It's a biopolymer. Like this is like a carbon-based food source, right? So there's a very high probability that you need to grow it in the ground, right? So I think it's very hard to debate that. But when you talk about decomposition of biopolymers, are you talking about all biopolymers, or are you talking about specific? Is there differences? Is there better and worse biopolymers? Did you have when you were compared to seaweed, did you have some that are like really, really bad, some that are really, really good? I had actually a guest who works with biopolymers, so I'd be very interested to hear let's say, an outside perspective on it. I think, for the sake of my education and the audiences, I would love to hear what are your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so when you look at seaweed itself, there's no bad biopolymer. Like seaweed is natural, and when you work with biopolymers from seaweeds, unless you modify them to some extent, which we don't, and to my knowledge, others don't either, seaweed biopolymers on their own will decompose just as well as a piece of seaweed on a shore eventually.
How long does that take? Sorry, how long does that take?
I'm not sure about the seaweed itself, but for us, our material decomposes within 12 weeks in soil, marine conditions, freshwater systems.
Wow.
It's through a process of hydrolysis, really, and as long as there is some sort of moisture, bacterial activity, natural bacterial activity, and oxygen present, it will decompose. If you look at seaweed on shore, probably takes longer, but that is due to other things in the seaweed. But eventually, it does decompose. I mean, it's a natural process, right? Plants grow, germinate, die, and eventually go back to carbon. So that's part of the cycle. That's not disruptive. When you look at biopolymers in seaweed in specific, you have some biopolymers which behave better with dry applications, others that work better with wet or higher moisture applications. When you look at our red seaweed biopolymers that we use, those are the ones that work better with dry applications, hence what we're trying to develop. Brown seaweed, when you work with alginates, you tend to work a lot with wet contents within your packaging as well, which is actually good because it means that there's no one size fits all. So eventually there will be different biopolymers, different companies developing different films or packaging forms that will be able to serve various parts of the market, various segments of the industry, and that's what we need. When you look at biopolymers overall, so going back to existing bioplastics that are currently on the market, which are now in research, you have the polylactic acid that I mentioned. When they put those in industrial composting facilities, you're exposed to high temperatures, in natural temperatures. So we're talking 60, 70 degrees Celsius plus. And they also do artificial addition of bacteria and microbes to actually facilitate the decomposition. So that's an artificial environment that is created. You do have other biopolymers on the market, but to a very limited extent. I'd say the only ones that actually are truly home compostable and could be a viable solution will be the PHAs and the PHBs, which will decompose in nature. The issue with that is that PHA and PHB, PHA in the specific, is a technology which has been known for many years. It was developed in the 1970s. But to this date, it's very hard to scale up commercially because it's very expensive to produce. And also it has some material properties which are undesirable in many applications. So it tends to be very brittle or not very transparent. So for that reason, the production of PHAs and PHBs and their applications are very limited.
So questions. I've speaking to a layperson, what is PHA and PHB? Can you somehow relate it to something in nature that I would understand? Can you explain more? Like what is grown for the PHAs and PHBs? Or what do we take at the ground?
Sure. So PHA stands for polyhydroxyalkanoate, and PHB is polyhydroxybutyrate. They're part of the same family. They're actually produced through bacterial fermentation. So what you do is you feed them some form of starch, again, whether it comes from some food crop, even food waste. People do microalgae as well. They start to starch. And essentially you feed this starch and sugary base to special bacteria and microbes. And as these microbes grow, they, like when we eat, if we eat a lot, we store our energy as fat. These microbes grow and store their energy as PHA and PHB. And essentially, once they've fattened up enough, you extract the PHA and PHB from them.
So basically, feed bacteria bread, and and then boom, you have a plastic replacement. That's the competition. In lay people's terms. So just to finish off on biopolymers, if you were like outside of seaweed, and we'll get back to seaweed in a second, but if you were to pick a biopolymer that's not seaweed, if you had to, like, except for seaweed, what would you pick? What would be your second choice?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there's promising results with bacterial cellulose. So cellulose, but it's derived from bacteria. But it's very expensive today. So it's, again, very limited. There's no real commercial application to the state because of how expensive it is to produce. But it would be a very good alternative, I think. And to be fair, even PHAs and PHBs, I mean, they work. They're just very expensive to produce. And if someone cracks that nut, it's definitely a viable application, a viable solution for certain applications.
It's very interesting. I think the guy that was on this podcast, Rudy Patel, I think he literally is doing this. So I recommend you listen to him. It'd be very interesting, like the two sides of plastic alternatives. And when you talk about cellulose, for the audience, I think most people wouldn't know if they don't have a background in biology, but cellulose is what makes up cell walls in plants. So I think they'll be extremely trippy. That we now hold random stuff like packaging of like the same stuff that like the hard stuff of plants is made of, that'll be extremely trippy. Very interesting. But yeah, so back to seaweed. And tell me, just because I thought of it now, is there cellulose in seaweed? Just a random question.
There is some within the seaweed cell structure, but we don't use it.
Okay, so it's not really the main thing. Okay, so time to dive deep into seaweed. First of all, and I ask this question to every entrepreneur, why is it that no one has been building stuff, or maybe not maybe there's some that have been building stuff with seaweed in the past, but why hasn't seaweed become mainstream yet if it's so good, like you say? What has been stopping humanity from exploring the applications?
What people don't realize is seaweed actually is rather mainstream, but you don't know it. So when you go into your shower and you use liquid shampoo, when you eat some yogurts or puddings or chocolate milk, you are eating seaweed derivatives. Like seaweed additives are in many, many different things, whether we're talking thickeners and emulsifiers, or whether we're talking about pigments, we're talking about lipids, a lot of omega-3, for example. There's a lot of companies developing omega-3 from microalgae and phytoplankton, because that's where it comes from originally. People say salmon and fatty fish have a lot of omega-3s. Well, guess what? Where do they get their fat? From the smaller fish they eat. And what do those small fish eat? Phytoplankton.
Seaweed.
So all there.
That's amazing. But why not in packaging? So okay, so it has useful chemicals. We've been using them for a long time. Why has no one decided, oh yeah, let's do packaging?
I think packaging has a slower adoption rate because it's harder to get into the supply chain. We're talking very big contracts, very big numbers. So you need to be able to commit to a certain amount of supply before you can actually be viable. And that's what we're working to be in the future, of course. But the thing is, the seaweed industry has grown exponentially as well in the past 15 years. It's been basically doubling every 5 years, and it's predicted to carry on doing so, if not even better. You have a lot of countries who have big plans to expand their potential. If you look about the amount of coastlines that we have out there, which are unexploited, you could grow so much seaweed, and companies and governments are realizing the potential of this. So I think it's a market which, as I said, has been exploited, but it's going to be exploited even more in the future. And as this market is growing, you have more sectors deriving from them. And people realize the potential of going into the seaweed industry and seeing how many applications you could have with it, one of which is packaging.
Wow. Amazing. So the future is made of seaweed. do you think so?
I think seaweed has a lot of applications in the future, mainly also as food supply goes. If you look at the population increasing so rapidly, I mean, you can grow seaweed in under 2 months. You can have a harvest, and it doesn't require any pesticides, fertilizers, inputs, fresh water at all, even arable land. I mean, it grows in salt water, which is a pretty hard place to grow things in if you're not seaweed, right? So it is rich in proteins, lipids, even carbohydrates. It is really important. And even when you look at what we're doing right now, when we extract our biopolymers from the seaweed, you're left over with a whole lot of things. So when you harvest seaweed, you generally dry it. And once you dry it, you do the extraction. And we harvest between 15 and 30%, depending on species, of our biopolymers. And that only represents less than a third of the overall seaweed weight. In the rest, in the remaining 70%, if not more, there still are all the lipids, proteins, biostimulants, pigments, even cellulose, fibers, you name it, everything is there, vitamins. that can still be used and have a lot of other purposes.
Mhm.
Today, normally, most of it, once you do the extraction of those biopolymers, is sold off as animal feed or soil remediation, because it takes in a lot of water, so it can help grow plants and agriculture in places which are normally scarce in water supply. So they will take in a lot of water,
Mhm.
store it, and you have to think that seaweed, once you dry it, loses about 90 to 95% of its weight. So it stores up a
Mhm.
lot of water when it's literally a sponge.
Mhm.
But as I said, it has a lot of these valuable things inside, which in the future will definitely be harvested per sort of segment of the seaweed crop. So there will
Mhm.
be a lot of exploitation in that sense. There is a future in seaweed, definitely.
Do you think in the future there's gonna be like large scale seaweed farms? And how would
Yes.
that work? This is really the next section. The next section of the interview I really want to dive deep into is like, okay, how do you access the seaweed? What's your supply chain of seaweed? Number one, and then number two, we talk about these large scale seaweed plantations. This is so trippy. Like, are they gonna be underwater? How is it going to work? So, enlighten us, please.
Yes, no, seaweed plantations, there will definitely be large scale, and there are already large scale seaweed plantations. In our case, when you talk about red seaweed, you're talking about, for most cases, subtropical and tropical species of seaweed. So the biggest producers for us are countries like Indonesia and Philippines, and in general,
Mhm.
Southeast Asia is the biggest producer and exporter. Even Vietnam, Malaysia, India, as well as beginning. They have a lot of production, and also on the eastern coast of Africa. So in Tanzania, Madagascar, they're also growing a lot. Similar in the northern parts of Africa towards Morocco, although Morocco tends to harvest more than cultivate, and even in Tunisia, Chile. There are a lot of places where seaweed is grown. Where you grow
Mhm.
seaweed is pretty simple. Generally, the traditional method, it's simply you put a stick on the beach and a stick somewhere out down the shoreline, and you put a rope between the sticks, and you tie a piece of seaweed to the rope at regular intervals.
Holy shit.
And basically, that piece of seaweed will grow in as long as it's in the water. Obviously, you can't do it too deep because it requires photosynthesis to grow
Mhm.
seaweed. So if you go deeper down the water, you have less solar rays penetrating. So it needs to be towards the surface so it can access that sun, which is beneficial to it. And when you harvest it, roughly 45 days later, you can have about 6 harvests a year, which is really, really good if you compare it to land crops like sugarcane, which requires up to
Mhm.
2 years to be ready
Mhm.
to harvest. Corn, about 9 months, so it's much, much faster. You
Mhm.
basically cut off the piece of seaweed that you need, and as long as you leave a tiny bit on the rope, that through vegetative propagation will grow back again.
What the fuck? This is a big deal because, like, I think the big advantage of that is that there's no land use. Like, we actually have a very big problem when it comes to land use. Like, obviously, as
Mhm.
you know, with our work at Tree Nation, one of the the main problem that we're solving before we're solving climate change is solving deforestation, right? Because we lose actually net on approximately 10 billion trees every single year, and that's just to run the economy normally. And if you were to extrapolate those numbers, basically by the end of the century you would have no more rainforests, and by the end of the
Mhm.
next century you would have no more trees, right? And we actually still need to increase the human population. Apparently the control, I forgot the term for this in ecology, but basically the number of people that the earth can sustain is around 11 billion apparently. So if you consider that we're around 8 billion and we're already losing 10 billion trees a year just to like live our life, I think it shows you the need to find new ways to sustain this population, because the reason why we have deforestation is because majority of land is already taken up by for farming, for food production, right? And
Mhm.
the easiest land to reclaim so you can grow more food would be the land that's covered with trees, right? Because all the other land that's like not going to grow anything has already been taken up, right? Or you can't grow anything there for various reasons related to the soil and the climate. So what you're suggesting, as a seaweed future, right? The future of seaweed would potentially like increase. So you can eat seaweed as well, right? I'm aware that you can eat seaweed, right? What like would can you let's talk about all of the applications of seaweed, because if you consider the fact that it solves the land use problem, right? Basically, right? It basically we start to be able to use the oceans and the seas and the coasts, right, to as some kind of source of production of, first, what you're saying, a replacement for plastic, and also food, which is the main thing that we're using land for. Um, do you see what I'm saying, and what are your thoughts about the seaweed future? What's the potential of seaweed as a material for humanity in your eyes?
Well, I'll tell you something, and you know this because of what you do.
Mm-hmm.
If you're to cut down a patch of forest to create a plot of land where you're going to grow your vegetables or whatever, basically agriculture,
Yes.
or pastures, even worse, you're losing trees, you're damaging the soil, and you're using fresh water. If you're taking a stretch rather of coast, and you're doing your seaweed plantation there, you're not using fresh water, you're not using land, you're not depleting land. If there is some soil or some form of eutrophication from rivers flowing into the sea, well, guess what? The seaweed will take in that nitrogen, those excess nutrients, and actually grow faster. It will promote ecosystems underwater because, of course, the seaweed brings in fish, and fish bring in more fish, and so on. So actually promotes as if it was an sort of artificial barrier reef. Not really a reef, but it creates an ecosystem. Again, if you were to cut down the trees and create a plot of land for agriculture, you're destroying that ecosystem, decreasing biodiversity. Seaweed promotes biodiversity. And also, if you, again, doing the parallel, if you do agriculture, the trees take in carbon dioxide, and so do the plants for which you grow, grow through your agriculture, but to a much limited extent because they're not as densely growing as a forest would. So there actually is less plant volume, less plant biomass. Seaweed takes in carbon as it grows because it photosynthesizes, just like a plant would. So it takes in carbon dioxide, and with sunlight, creates oxygen. Not only does it take carbon dioxide, but it takes carbon dioxide that is in the water. So this carbon dioxide, as it goes into the water, dissolves into carboxylic acid, and which is the main reason for coral reefs basically melting down. I mean, coral is made of calcium carbonate, and if you react it with an acid, it will fizz and melt away. So seaweed actually decreases ocean acidification as well. There really is no negative. It seems almost too good to be true, but that is the truth. And if if governments were to realize the potential that seaweed has for the cultivation because of its applications, but also because of its positives that comes with, I mean, the world really will be a better place. It really has a lot of potential. And whilst a diet made entirely of seaweed probably wouldn't be the nicest to eat, I'm sure it's just a matter of time before some very hip startup comes up with a meal replacement shake made out of seaweed, and that will be the end of
it. That would be hilarious. I mean, this is amazing, but I have to admit, and I think you notice, it's also funny because it's seaweed. Like just this random thing that you would never think of, and which has so much potential. It's insane. So, do you think, based on what you just said, that you could use seaweed to save the coral reef, for example?
It's definitely not the solution, but it will definitely play potentially a part. I mean, if you're contributing to the acidification of the oceans, you're doing your part. It's funny to think, if you want to make another funny joke, that seaweed is the thing that as a kid you hate because it sticks to your legs as you leave the beach, but then it can actually be very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, you should keep it on your leg and bring it home and and manufacture it.
Maybe bite into it, see if it's a nice dinner.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. So, did you think about nutritious applications of seaweed? Like, if you consider what if what your company could become in the future, right? Do you think that you could do more applications of seaweed than just packaging? Did this cross your mind? Because you'd be vertically integrated, so it would be easy to diversify like this. Did you think about this yet? So, did you investigate other things that you could do with seaweed potentially in the future with Flexi?
Yes, absolutely. It is within our plans to vertically integrate upstream eventually, mainly not to produce other products from seaweed. That's at least what we think today. Everything is open, you never know. But definitely to vertically integrate at least the extraction of the biopolymers from the seaweed. So right now we buy those biopolymers as being pre-extracted because still our lab scale doesn't make sense for us to work with seaweed. I mean, it just saves up a step and the end result will be the same. However, in the future, we want to vertically integrate this. And as I mentioned earlier, there is technology being developed out there to actually be able to sequentially extract all your different components of the seaweed. So our biopolymers, but then also the lipids, vitamins, proteins, biostimulants, etc., etc. And when that becomes a reality, we definitely want to become part of that.
So let's talk now a bit more about Flexi. So tell me again, share what you want to share. I think we should keep your confidentiality intact, like whatever business secrets you don't want to release, then don't. But what can you tell us about Flexi? What can you tell us about the stage we're at right now? When you want to plan to go to market? What are, let's say, the main challenges in the way? And what's the vision for the next 5, 10, 20 years, if that's how long you want to stay with it? So tell us, please.
Sure. So right now we're still in the lab stage of doing research and development. So we're pre-commercial. We do not sell our material yet. And that is because although we do have a material which we really like, we're really close to it, we dream of it, we're still not as good as we want it to be for the market. So we still have to improve certain characteristics of the material itself. And that's what we're doing day in and day out. So working in the lab, developing the material really. And we plan to be hopefully on the market with a finished material by the end of next year. That's sort of our timeline. By then, once that happens, we will go on and do business development, and hopefully what we want to do is license our IP to companies who already are producing plastic out there, because those companies are facing the problem of consumers demanding more and more sustainable alternatives for what they're doing now. So mainly films of petroleum-based plastic, but they don't have a viable solution, and we want to become the providers of that solution. Speaking of IP, right now we have a patent pending formulation and processing of our material, and we will most definitely file more patents down the line to improve on our formulations, have different variations of formulations for different applications. If you want to look at applications of our material, I mentioned earlier we are better suited for dry applications. So dry applications mean non-aqueous, so anything that is not water-based. We could do, for example, bags and pouches of rice, pasta, pulses, beans, single doses of salt and sugar, even honey, oil. But then also in the dry applications, we have non-food items. And that's also a very huge market, which we actually plan to exploit earlier because it's easier to get into. It's less regulated. You don't need accreditations. And our material right now is so natural because of what we put in it. So both the Seaweed polymers and all the other additives that we use are actually classified as food additives, both by the EFSA in Europe and the FDA in the US. So to make it short, our material is so natural we can eat it, literally. And we've done that. I'm alive, so I can tell you we can definitely do that.
You ate some?
I have, yeah, 3 different stages of development.
Okay, go on.
That's probably not what you want to do with packaging eventually, because the packaging supply chain is not very hygienic. You don't know where your pack of pasta has been by the time it gets home. I mean, it's been on supermarket shelves. People pick it up, put it down, warehouses. Don't even want to think about it. I wouldn't. I would wash my hands after I touch it, let alone eat it. But the fact that you can eat the material for us is the ultimate proof of biodegradability. You know, it's so natural, even our body can handle it.
Could you feed a dog? Sorry for interrupting. Could you feed a pet?
I mean, animals are part of the living things that can eat it, obviously, yes. That's actually one of our key selling points, is that, as I said, we can eat it, and we wouldn't want to eat it because it's not hygienic, but you can eat it. Similarly, if the plastic ends up in the ocean and a turtle comes by and eats it before it is biodegraded, it will pass through its body naturally just as food. So that's sort of our really good points out there. And I was talking before, sorry, I go off on tangents. I was talking before about non-food dry applications. If you think, for example, IKEA, when they sell you the furniture, they're full of those little bags of single-use screws and nails and bolts, and that's a perfect application for what we're doing. Similarly, when you go into the hospitality sector, you go into a hotel, in the hotel room, you'll find your slippers in a plastic bag. You go to the bathroom and you have your cotton buds in plastic, your toothbrush in plastic, your soap in plastic, everything. That's also something we can do. And that can also be expanded to, as I said, hotels, but also hospitals, cruise ships, airlines. We want to get in there.
Wow. Okay. So how would this look like? Let's say I go to IKEA, right, and
Mhm.
I go get some nails, right? What would the packaging look like? How do you envision it to look?
Well, ideally, and that's the case today, and it will stay the case most likely, you won't really see a difference. The good thing is that our
Whoa.
material looks a lot like plastic. I mean, it feels and looks and behaves like plastic. It's heat sealable, it's transparent, it's really, we like to call it a seamless solution to plastic
Hmm.
pollution.
Hmm.
Basically, you keep
Ah,
on
good one.
living your life, do your thing as you do today, but you'll just decrease the harm that your consumption does to the planet eventually because
Mhm,
of our material. That's sort of our philosophy. Uh, One thing that we always say is that people love innovation but hate change because change
mhm,
implies an active role in what you're doing.
mhm,
We want to be a passive innovation where you
mhm,
keep doing what you do, you don't change your habits, you don't change your whatever you do day to
mhm,
day, but the impact of what you do changes because what you're using changes, although you don't actually have to do an active change for that to happen,
mhm,
if it makes
mhm.
sense.
Yes, and I have a very specific question on this, right? So on the passive innovation that you were saying with with those bags, in my opinion, right, and you tell me what you think of it because you probably thought of it. If you have those bags and they look nearly exactly like the IKEA bags, if you would add some small difference in how it looks, I don't know, some kind of stripes or something, don't you think it would make people be like, "Oh my God, look, we're so trendy. We're now using this like seaweed." I was going to call it plastic bag, but seaweed bag, right? Don't you think that having like a slight difference in how it looks like will be a good thing because then people can more easily recognize that, oh my God, this is like not plastic, like this is actually seaweed, and then they would talk about it more. Did you guys think about this? What's your thoughts on that?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, that is down to the marketing potential of the material for the
Mhm.
company using it. I
Yes.
mean, if
Mhm.
IKEA or whoever will be, we're not sponsored by anyone, just putting that out there. If whoever uses the plastic realizes that by printing something like that, but it's a recognizable logo or whatever on their pouch and bag, whatever, the people will realize, oh, look, that's not plastic. It's natural. It's biodegradable. It's cool. Let's use it. We prefer this to petroleum based. Let's do it. That's absolutely untapped marketing potential for them that they can go through. I mean, our material is personalizable. We can
Mhm.
color it. We can print it. So that is absolutely down to it. What we can't do, however, is have our material be just our material and limit what companies can do with it because at the end of the
Mhm.
day it is the company's product and packaging isn't
Mhm.
there to sell the product itself, it's there to help
Mhm.
deliver the product to the customer, so we cannot
Mhm.
become sort of the main label on the product.
Yeah, no, I get you completely. So it's kind of very similar to how they replaced plastic straws with paper straws in McDonald's and Burger King, and they look they're way less useful. Like as a product, I would say that the straws are not that good compared to plastic straws, but you know that you were using a paper straw. You know that's
Mhm.
the main idea behind it. So. Well, the future looks very, very interesting from everything that you're saying. So let's talk about roadmaps. And I know they're rough, and I know how business startups work. Things get difficult, plans change, you pivot. Things nearly always take longer than you expect, nearly in every
Yeah.
case, right? From my experience. But tell me, let's say these bags, if all goes well, in what year can we see them in like an IKEA or any kind of shop like that?
Yes, I mean that's our plan eventually to find companies that can use our material based on what they're doing today. As I said,
Mhm,
one size does not fit all, so you have to look at the specific applications. And if they want to use our material, hopefully we will find production partners strategically located in different places that can produce our material and sort of serve their need. When you look
mhm,
at companies right now, they're buying the plastic from plastic suppliers. They wouldn't have to change what they're doing now; they just have to change the material they buy. But the suppliers hopefully will be the same, or at least the same procedure. That's our plan,
mhm,
and that's from a year and a half's time onwards. Of course, the longer the time, the more will be, hopefully. In the
mhm.
meantime, we also plan to take out various versions of the material where there is, because we might have to differentiate between food and non-food applications, different thicknesses, different sturdiness levels. And down the line, there's also potential for us to use to explore, for example, rigid and semi-rigids. Right now, we're focusing just on flexible films for two reasons. Simply because by pure chance, that's what I started doing because it's the easiest thing I started doing in my home lab a year and a half ago now, 2 years ago. It is the simplest thing you can sort of develop at a very low chemistry grade scale. But then also because it is the material, when you look at films, that is least recycled. So I mentioned before the really low recycling rates. Those actually are mostly made up of PET bottles because they're quite sturdy. They clean in most cases because liquids can be cleaned off very, very easily. And there's quite a bit of plastic in them. Films, they tend to be the dirtiest, and also they're so thin that there's barely any plastic within them. Not that they're not made of plastic, it's a very little amount of plastic stretched over a large surface area. And because recycling, in the end of the day, I mean, it is a business, it's not worthy to take up that big volume for that little amount of plastic itself. So recyclers will not turn on their machines and put on the process because it's not economical enough for them when you compare it to semi-rigids like plastic bottles.
So when you look at the future now a little bit further, and I like to have these conversations with entrepreneurs, especially in when you guys are like in your first couple of years. Do you think like in 10 years, in 20 years, right? Do you have like an end goal or some kind of like success stage that you dream about? And what does that look like? And what kind of applications would you have for the seaweed? So I understand the baggies. I think they're awesome. And anything like a poly pockets, I mean, that would be a very similar thing that you could do, although nobody uses pages anymore, actually, as a matter of fact. But long term, let's say in the best case scenario, what kind of applications of seaweed would you be interested in producing?
As in just non-plastic, you mean?
Whatever. I mean, you pick. I mean, what's the in 10 years? What's like some of the coolest things that you would like to do?
In 10 years? Well, assuming the plastic that we have right now is going well, and perhaps other versions or variations of it are doing just as well. Looking at the vertical integration of it, as I mentioned earlier, when you look at the extraction, we could perhaps be looking into supplements of some types, so whether it is the omega-3s or even using the waste, the end waste, even after all the extraction, the end waste to produce some other sort of material or composite. We'll have to see that. I mean, it's very abstract, to be fair, but that's the beauty of it, right? Seaweed has potential that you don't know where it's going to bring you tomorrow. It is that nice. Honestly, who knows? We might even get into seaweed cultivation itself one day. We don't know.
So right now, what's the coolest idea in your head?
Oof. Coolest idea? I tend to focus on what we're doing right now and try and keep going.
I know, but you have the thoughts now. Like now and then, it slips in.
Yeah. I don't know. The vertical integration has lots of potential also for decreasing overall pricing of everything. I mean, seaweed isn't very expensive today, but if it becomes even cheaper down the line, it becomes an even bigger resource to tap into for all the reasons that we just discussed. So I think the vertical integration and perhaps the seaweed cultivation are the ones that sort of like brighten up a bit more in my eyes. Because not only would you be helping what we're doing today, obviously stimulate the industry, make it more affordable, better integrated, but then you're also having all the positive connotations I mentioned earlier from the seaweed industry itself. So right now, we will be producing a plastic which solves the plastic issue, but then if you cultivate the seaweed, you also have the fact that you're solving or at least decreasing a lot of other issues.
So your dream is to control the seaweed supply chain.
Okay, you can say that.
It's amazing. So look, Carlo, this has been an amazing episode. I've learned it was one of the most entertaining ones and educational ones for sure. And I think what you're doing is amazing, and I think there's massive potential in the future of your company and the technology and seaweed in general. I find it very inspiring as I talk to these various entrepreneurs, usually startup stage, doing stuff in sustainability, and there's so many solutions. I mean, like there's so many solutions to sustainability, and you are really a big part of that solution. And what you're driving forward, I would love to get behind in whichever way I can help. I mean, in addition to the podcast that we're doing today, I really believe in what you're doing. And I really thank you for coming on the podcast, and we should do this again sometime, maybe in a couple of months. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. And yeah, we should definitely catch up and see if what I said today is just a dream, or maybe it could become a reality one day. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
I mean,
Fingers
I really
crossed.
hope we can.
My
do
fingers are crossed for this. I mean, sounds amazing. All right then, Carlos. It's been a pleasure. I wish you the very best end of your day or evening. And yeah, that's it. So I'll let you know when it's out. Okay.
Thank you very much, Philip.
Ciao, ciao, Carlo.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.